Historians refer to the hundreds of years or so after initial contact between Europeans and people from the Americas as the Columbian Exchange. And this idea refers to the transfer of people from the New World to the Old World, whether that was Europeans settling in the Americas, whether that was indigenous peoples going to Europe or being sold into slavery in different parts of the Americas. As we'll see soon here in the story, once indigenous people started dying, being ravaged by diseases like smallpox, Europeans increasingly turned to African slaves to bring to the New World and use them as the labor that they needed. Crops, plants, animals were exchanged. Things like sugar, chocolate, horses, tobacco, these would change societies fundamentally for the rest of history. Diseases, as we've already seen, would transfer from both New World to Old World and Old World to New World. Ideas, religions. So this term Columbian Exchange refers to the broader process of all of these things being exchanged, and it's really during the post-conquest period of this Spanish conquest of the Aztec that we first start to see this Columbian Exchange in action on a large scale. And like we've done before in the story of the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire, it's really hard not to play the what-if game. When you look at the Columbian Exchange in a textbook, it's easy to lose the human element of things. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Some plants and animals got traded, some religions spread to new areas. What's the big deal? But as we're going to see here, the processes that start coming together as a result of this Columbian Exchange, particularly in this post-conquest period, are the beginnings of so many things in the history of the Americas that are going to be so important and ultimately so tragic. This period will launch the beginnings of the encomienda system of forced labor in Mexico. It will establish the racial casta system, class tension in Mexico, tension between Spanish at home in the mother country and Spanish ruling in Mexico. It will see the transfer of people and slaves, both indigenous and increasingly now African, during this period. And you're also really seeing the origins of revolution that would come hundreds of years later. Maybe too little and too late for some. Of course, knowing what we know now, having the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to play the what-if game. Because you have to wonder, was the outcome that we got here the worst outcome that we could have gotten? Remember that for many people, this story is often taken as inevitable, like it couldn't have happened any other way. But what if Cortez had gotten sick before reaching Tenochtitlan? What if the Spanish hadn't escaped on La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows? What if they had been defeated and forced to submit right then and there? What if the Tlaxcalans had never allied with the Spanish? Would we have gotten the same outcome that we got? I think it's something to keep in mind from a big picture perspective when thinking about the Columbian Exchange, and especially when thinking about the conclusion of this story. From the mid-1500s into the 1600s, when Spanish rule is cemented and crystallized. And these processes that we just outlined are now pretty much set in stone for the next couple hundred years. So From about the 1520s into the 1550s, the Mexica people, at least in Tenochtitlan, were allowed a sort of form of self-rule where they would elect a ruler who would then have to be approved by the Spanish, and oftentimes the Mexica would be alternating between the branches of the families in a similar way that they were doing before the Spanish arrived. But around 1563, the Spanish ultimately decide that they're going to make Tenochtitlan a city that has to pay direct tribute, just like all of the other surrounding cities. This is a huge problem because the people in Tenochtitlan were already vastly overworked. They were already experiencing coerced labor. But unfortunately, the King of Spain was strapped for cash and needed a quick infusion. So in 1564, a new tribute law goes into effect. The people of Tenochtitlan would have to pay 14,000 pesos to the crown, as well as substantial payments of corn. Obviously, this is incredibly upsetting for the Mexica people, and there's even Spanish people on the ground in Tenochtitlan who are telling the higher-ups, this is a terrible idea, don't do this. Tensions are rising, and in July, members of the Indigenous Council are arrested. Basically held hostage, the Spanish demand that the Indigenous not only will have to give extra tribute now, but they're going to have to continue doing public works, essentially rebuilding the city of Tenochtitlan to make it look more European. The Spanish tell this Indigenous Council that 300 people are going to be arrested at random if they don't comply. Armed Spanish are going house to house, demanding tribute or arresting people. And at some point, a riot breaks out on the streets of Tenochtitlan. A guy by the name of Juan Batista was there, and he says, quote, "There was more raging and shouting, and they insulted the governor himself. A member of the Indigenous Council jumped in, separating people and restraining them. He had his staff of office on his shoulder. Suddenly, they grabbed it from him and were going to kill him. They ganged up together to kill him. They pulled his shirt off. Just naked was how they left him. They got Juan Cano out of there. He took out his sword so they would have to back off and let him go. Otherwise, he would have died at the people's hands. And while people were crying out, everybody gathered on the rooftops, and the Spaniards on their roofs. Some ran to hear what was happening at the Tecpan, and others ran away. The ones doing business at the market all came, and all the people in the houses came out, the old women and the old men, the children, the people of the Altepet. People threw stones at the upper floor of the building. They destroyed a floral carving that ran around the wall. Then a Spanish officer came and took out his sword and chased people. The Spaniards and some of the mestizos who were there all took out their swords and dispersed people. The women broke through the patio wall on the left side, where people were flung. Men and women just climbed over each other, so that they fell back and screamed and shouted. Many really got hurt, and they hammered one old woman's face. The Spanish officers gathered really fast and pursued people and dispersed them. Right away, they took people prisoner. The ones whom they collected, they took upstairs and put into the hands of the governor, who beat them. When they were beaten, their hands were tied. The Spaniards went to close all the roads everywhere. Everywhere, people were seized along the roads. They armed themselves with lances, shields, and other weapons." End quote. A bit of a chaotic and confusing quote there, but you get the sense of this rising tension and this violence that's breaking out and a dangerous and chaotic situation unfolding. Eventually, Cortez's son by Malinche, a guy by the name of Don Martin, arrives to break it up, and he helps disperse the crowds. But when all was said and done, the Spanish would sentence 46 people to be shaved, whipped, paraded through the streets, and sold into servitude for 2 to 5 years. The Spanish inspector who was sent by King Philip to figure out the situation in Tenochtitlan, first of all, a fairly delusional fellow, but he's especially delusional after the riot, not understanding that a people who ruled this empire for close to 200 years suddenly wouldn't want to start paying harsh tributes and help the Europeans polish their new buildings. This inspector, a guy by the name of Valderrama, after this riot breaks out, he wrote to King Philip II saying, quote, "One can't believe that this riot by a few Indians could have happened if they hadn't been incited to it, because besides the fact that they are naturally so obedient, the new tax has been of great benefit to them. An animal without reason understands and recognizes the good that is done for him, more than a man, even though he has a bit of reason. I have made a great effort to understand them, and the situation has not become clear." End quote. We see the civilizing mission here at work in that quote from Valderrama. He's genuinely perplexed why the Mexica won't just accept the new tribute. In his mind, the Mexica are lesser people. As he just said, they're more akin to animals. And an animal is naturally obedient. And an animal should understand when they are being brought into a civilization for the benefit of everybody. And that's what these taxes and tributes are going to do. And so I think it's important here to make note of that and pause a little bit, because the civilizing mission has multiple components. It's not just somebody like Cortez coming in and conquering. You also have these bureaucrats and administrators like Inspector Valderrama, who use things like taxes and tribute and labor systems to enforce their version of the civilizing mission. And of course, you have the priests and the friars doing their own version of this. So you can see that the Mexica are being hit on all sides. And what's interesting is that as the printing press is ramping up and as writings about what's going on in the former Aztec Empire are being proliferated both in Europe and in the Americas, the Mexica are actually reading about the civilizing mission while it's happening. And many were reading the writings in particular of one Bartolomé de las Casas. De las Casas is very famous historically for being someone that was on the initial missions of Columbus and someone who documented all the horrible things that Columbus was doing and largely disagreed with the inhumane treatment of the indigenous people. So historically speaking, De las Casas is often celebrated as being someone who, at the time period, recognized the immorality of the whole civilizing mission. And it's a nice way to show that, A, not everybody that was Spanish necessarily agreed with people like Columbus or Cortez. B, we can say that people at the time period did disagree and think differently morally, and that people at the time period knew that what the Spanish were doing here was wrong. But there's another element to this. Historian Helen Nader, in her paper, The One World and Two Americas of Hernando Cortez and Bartolomé de las Casas, talks about how even though de las Casas was generally a much more preferable moral figure from the indigenous perspective, de las Casas and Cortez were two sides of the same coin from a civilizing mission perspective. They both came from the same Spanish cultural upbringing, and they both have the same beliefs on what makes a people civilized or not. They both believed that living in towns or cities was one of those ideas. They just had different solutions to those problems. As we know, Cortez just conquered the Aztec Empire and called what they already had towns. De las Casas took a more educational and religious approach, where he wanted to bring people together into these towns so that he could implement his Christian version of reality onto them. So historians often compare the two men and their morals, or their lack of morals in Cortez's case, and I think it's right to do that, and it gives us a sense of the morality of the time period. But it's also perhaps ironic that both of these men are two sides of the same civilizing mission coin, and sort of the hubris of thinking that you can erase or replace or change another culture. Talking about this, historian Helen Nader says, quote, Las Casas limited his experience to the Caribbean islands and parts of Central America. Because he held the same values of civilization that Cortez did, however, he refused to recognize as valid the non-urban migratory life of the native people he loved. He invented one scheme after another to organize them into self-governing towns. But even when Las Casas succeeded in organizing migrant Amerindians into towns according to his reforms, he found himself losing the battle to maintain their populations. He was convinced that the high mortality among the Amerindians was caused by the Spaniards, whom he charged with working with the Amerindians too hard and treating them cruelly. The irony is, of course, that bringing together inhabitants from many different islands and continents continuously exposed virgin populations to new diseases. Stripped of their traditional tribal society and unaccustomed to cooperating in the European mold of town citizenship, the new Amerindian towns became trapped in a cycle of resettlement and depopulation. Las Casas and other missionaries, by forcing the migratory Amerindians into towns, endangered their lives as surely as Cortez with his military conquest. Historians and popular writers have seen Cortez and Las Casas as opposites, the embodiments of all that was bad and good in Spanish Christian society. Focusing on their differences, however, obscures the great common ground that bound the two men together as Spaniards, with a single worldview and a common vocabulary. Soldier and priest shared the assumption that all civilized people lived in self-governing towns. This implicit acceptance of municipal self-governance shaped the ideas and careers of both Cortez, conqueror of the Amerindians, and Las Casas, defender of the Amerindians, and contributed to the success of one and the failure of the other. End quote. By the early 1600s, the dual-sided coin of the civilizing mission, the combination of smallpox, forced labor, depleted resources, the abuses of the tribute system, had severely impacted the indigenous population. By about 1610, there were only 25,000 or so left in and around Tenochtitlan. They were now a minority. But for the Spanish, the work had to continue. And the only answer to this problem of where is the labor source going to come from if the Mexica population is so low, the only answer is the African slave trade, which ramps up hugely during this time period, and especially to Mexico before the year 1600. African slaves worked in silver mines or as slaves on encomiendas and plantations. Many worked in Mexico City in textile shops or construction, helping to build the increasingly massive Mexico City. The Spanish decreed that slavery could now be inherited through the mother's side. And this came as a shock to the Mexica, who didn't do hereditary slavery, by the way. But this decree essentially ties all blacks to slavery permanently, although it was possible to be a free black during this period, but it wasn't common. Africans did have their own communities. They attended churches. They celebrated their culture in different ways. Sometimes they ran away to form maroon communities. They protested certain brutal killings. And the brutal killings happened. The increasing numbers of blacks scared the hell out of the Spanish, just as all slaves in all slave societies eventually scare their masters. On Easter week of 1612, there was a rumored plot that black leaders were going to overthrow the Spanish, divvy up the Spanish women amongst themselves, and kill all the Spanish men. It's possible, according to Camilla Townsend, that there was some sort of plot to protest a brutal killing of a female slave by a Spanish master in 1611, but that's unlikely because that particular protest already had its culprits arrested and flogged. So with rumors flying out of control and Spanish leaders in Tenochtitlan terrified, the Spanish took 28 men and 7 women to the town square in the center of Tenochtitlan, and they were hanged. It took 3 full hours to hang all of them. The authorities wanted to display the bodies on the streets of the cities, but the health officials and the priests had to stop them. So they displayed a few and piled up the rest in the basement of a building. African and indigenous slaves, as well as some Asians who were kidnapped in India or the Philippines by the Spanish and sent to the Americas, these people known as Chinos, these slaves or forced labor groups helped to turn Tenochtitlan into modern-day Mexico City. The Spanish ordered the permanent draining of Lake Texcoco. They used indigenous labor to build massive ditches and drainage systems. Indigenous sources say that thousands of Mexica would die in those irrigation ditches. From a leadership perspective, the Mexica people no longer had any say in who was going to be in charge in Tenochtitlan. Different factions of Spanish began to have very different views on how to rule Mexico and who should be in charge. Spanish born in the New World, known as Creoles, began to have very different interpretations of how to rule compared with Spanish born in Spain. You also began to see tension between indigenous and mestizo, which meant mix of Spanish and indigenous. And the tribute systems that the Spanish imposed on indigenous people began to exacerbate the differences between upper-class Mexica families and commoners. The tributes and the taxes, like most tributes and taxes historically, hit the common people much harder. Ultimately, a big part of this story is the Mexica moving on with life, quietly protesting by coming up with a census to demonstrate the unfairness of the tribute the Spanish imposed, continuing to work, trying to build consensus between the different classes and neighborhoods that had developed during this period, writing their own histories so that they wouldn't be forgotten, enduring, and sometimes even learning to love the products and the ideas and the structures that the Columbian Exchange brought to them. Whether it was the music or the writings or the food or increasingly, for many, Christianity. Camilla Townsend astutely points out, quote, "Have any of the world's peoples ever allowed themselves to be flattened by crisis forever?" End quote. So, despite the Columbian nightmare here that led to massive imbalances in power, disease, the flooding of their city and the destruction and rebuilding of it, legal restrictions for hundreds of years, unfair tribute systems, terrible poverty. Ultimately, this was not the story of the demise of a people. The works of history that they created and the enduring legacy of the people who survived all of this still give people something to look back on, and this stuff also gives people a promise of a future. Tezo Zomok, one of these post-conquest indigenous chroniclers, says, quote, "What the ancestors came to do, what they came to establish, their writings, their renown, this history, their memory, will never perish, will never be forgotten in times to come. We shall always keep them, we sons, grandsons, younger brothers, great-great-grandchildren, great-grandchildren, we their descendants, and those yet to live, yet to be born, will go on telling of them, will go on celebrating them." End quote. The events and people of this story would go on to impact the rest of Mexican history, and we would see the Revolution of 1810 and the Revolution of 1910, leaving a legacy of indigenous continuing to struggle and make their lives better. There are currently about 1 million Nahua speakers in modern-day Mexico. So, of course, this story matters for the people who were involved in it and can directly trace their roots to the people who were involved in it. But it also should matter for the rest of us, too. As Camilla Townsend says, quote, "We should listen for their sake, but we should also do it for our own. For who can say which is the more empowered, them or us, if we can speak to each other successfully across the chasm of time and difference? Do we ourselves not become both wiser and stronger every time we grasp the perspective of people whom we once dismissed?" If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.